So as Conrad said, I'm going to talk for about half an hour. I'm going to start off in cybersecurity. I'm going to move through technology, geopolitics, and stuff. I'll warn you now, this is not a particularly edifying talk. I don't know what the answers are. This is much more about posing questions that we need to answer. I want to say thanks for coming, because I know it's a bit weird coming into a room like this. Thanks for the folks online as well. Please, please, please do ask questions, because I think this needs to be the start of a proper debate. This isn't, for a change, me just ranting at people. This needs to be the proper debate. So start off with cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is really changing. And I don't just mean things like Ukraine changing our risk calculus, but at a much more fundamental level about how we do it. So when we set the NCSC up sort of 6 years ago, one of the things we said was we're going to bring science to cybersecurity. Because if you actually think about a lot of what goes on in the name of cybersecurity, it ends up being people going, kind of feels about right, and there's no science behind it. So it's all professional judgment. We need to try and fix some of that, and I'll explain why as we go through. Over the next 10 years, I reckon cybersecurity is going to change absolutely fundamentally, to the point that the way we do it today will not continue to work. Now, that's quite a big statement, right? But if you think about the things that we do today in terms of trusting vendors, trusting technology, believing confidence about particular implementations, as I go through what I'm going to talk about, you'll see that a lot of that seems to fall away, and in very different ways than we used to. Second thing that's changing is our reliance on technology is changing. It's ever more embedded in our societies. So just think about the way you use a device, whether it's a phone, whether it's a tablet, whatever it is, whether you've got a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or something else that tracks your movements, your location, how fit you are. How could that data be used to help you or to not help you? Those are the things that are getting more and more embedded in our lives every day. I'm going to come back to that in a second. There's a lot of legacy technology. So a lot of the stuff that's running today that keeps the country going, that keeps big businesses going, is 20 years old. Nobody knows how it works. I'll give you a real example. There's something called signaling system number 7. It is the thing that allows international telecoms to work. So when you place a phone call, SS7 is used to contact the remote network, to negotiate how you talk to somebody, and so on and so on. It's 1975, right? Literally, the people who understand how it's working are dying because they're old, right? That keeps the entire world connected. Right? How do we not ever end up in this situation again? And the impact in the real world is going up hugely as well. So I don't mean things like pipelines, right? That's a relatively simple impact. But think about what happens when there's a big data breach, what it means to the people who are involved in it. Think about what happens when bits of technology, Gloucester City Council had a ransomware 4 months ago. Okay, today, people in Gloucester cannot move house because of that attack. So these things have real world consequences. We talk a lot about emerging technologies. I actually think a lot of the emerging technologies we talk about have emerged, right? So AI being my favorite. But let's start with quantum, right? So quantum is this kind of amorphous thing that everybody talks about, and everybody talks about really scared because quantum is coming. There's different sorts of quantum. Right? There's quantum computing, there's quantum sensing, there's quantum imaging, there's quantum timing. There's all sorts of different things that are enabled by new physics that we just start to understand. Quantum computing is the one we all talk about because it breaks security on the internet. Right? And so we have this conversation that the internet is insecure if somebody gets a quantum computer. Sort of. The internet's insecure if somebody gets a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, which isn't the same as a useful quantum computer, right? Then they've got to be able to use it. So let's say, my biggest adversary, the Ruritanians, have a quantum computer that can break the internet. What are they going to use it for, right? Are they going to use it to look at all of my bank transactions? Almost certainly not. Well, firstly, because it's all Amazon like everybody else is, but secondly, it's not that interesting. That's not what you want to use it for. They're certainly not going to use it to start breaking things, to have an effect in the real world, because that gives away you've got a quantum computer and suddenly it becomes useless. And so we've got to be really precise about the impacts we expect from these new technologies. Artificial intelligence. So we talk about artificial intelligence as though it is a single thing, and it is not. It's a set of maths, some of which is from the 1700s, and a set of emergent properties of that that are driven by massive data and massive compute. Right? So the algorithms are not really the clever bit. The clever bit is how you train them up and then how you use them. And here's the interesting thing, for me anyway, you might disagree. The thing that's important about AI for me is who has access to the training data, because that determines how good your use of AI can be. Not the algorithms, right? They're all done in open science. They're all pretty much of a muchness. Access to compute and access to data are the things that are going to matter in AI. So let's talk about healthcare. So the UK government, the NHS, does not have free access to all of your health records for random research purposes. Chinese government has access to all Chinese citizens' healthcare records for random research. Who's going to do better training an AI model to detect cancer? Us, Chinese. It's not us, is the short answer, right? And so there's a set of things about how we cope with our values, restricting some of the things we can do in the face of strategic adversaries, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. We've also got things like AI for security versus security for AI. So lots of people say we're going to use artificial intelligence to defend networks. Awesome. And people are going to use artificial intelligence to attack networks. Awesome. I don't care. I care much more about the security of AI. So how can I trust these things to do what they are intended to do and nothing else? Security for AI is a 1990s threat model at the moment, right? Because it's back in the day when you had your own computer, nobody could touch it. I'm going to run my model on there and it'll be perfect. Nobody can screw around with it. World ain't like that. And so we need to really invest in security for AI before we start putting these things in places where they can make decisions. And then the final thing I'll talk about in terms of emerging technologies is something called new IP. If anybody's heard of this one, this was a submission by Huawei to the ITU about a protocol set that redefines how the internet works. So their assertion was, as speeds go up and up and up, so as we get to terabit class networks, and you need completely deterministic timings and routings for that traffic, the current internet doesn't work. And so we need this other way of doing it. Is that right? Who knows? Anybody here know? I'll tell you something about it. It was awesome. Everybody knows about DNS. Yeah, so the domain name system, so it looks up, translates an address into an IP address. New IP used a blockchain for DNS. And all you've got to do is kind of sit and think about the energy consumption of that. Well, that's probably not the right answer. Right? There's a whole set of impacts on this stuff. So how do we start to judge it? How do we start to make sure that the right values are embedded in things? The other thing that's changing is commoditization of threat. So it used to be the case that in order to do kind of high-level attacks, you'd need to spend 10 years developing as a government your own capability, your own understanding of how to do computer network attack, computer network exploitation. You'd have grown up understanding, as you get better and better at this, how you manage the collateral intrusion, how you manage vulnerabilities well. That's not the case anymore. People like NSO Group, people like Candiru and others, yeah, their carefully selected customers are people who've got a few million quid. And so you have completely new actors coming onto the scene with what you can notionally say is nation state level capability without really understanding the collateral damage they can do. And so there's a real thing here about how we better control vulnerabilities, how we better control CNE capability, how we better control these sorts of things so that the world does not end up in a worse place. We're also seeing technology as part of great power competition. So that our own integrated review, the UK government's integrated review, says in some detail, we are going to become awesome at science and technology. It says we're going to become a science and technology superpower. Don't ask me. But we're going to be awesome at science and tech, right? We're going to do cyber power responsibly. We're going to do all these other things. So we've set out our stall. The US has shown that it has power globally with its extraterritorial laws. So look at the sanctions against Huawei that the US did. Right? That had huge effect globally, not just in China, but every country in the world, pretty much. right? And so you're starting to see these interdependencies coming out. China itself has stood up and said, Made in China 2025. We no longer want to be dependent on our strategic adversaries for key technologies. What does that mean? Come back to that later. As we start to go down this route of more and more technologies being more and more embedded in our lives, the impacts get much, much bigger. So think today about identity. So you have a physical identity. Hopefully yours is better than mine. And you've got a set of digital identities that go with it. Right? And today, your primary identity is your physical one. All of your digital identities are secondary. If you don't have them, it's not the end of the world. Think forward 5 years. The trajectory we're on, your digital identity will be your primary identity. You'll be unable to function in society without access to your digital identity. What does that mean? Well, today, your digital identity is vulnerable to you being slightly tipsy and clicking a link and typing your password in. Your digital identity is vulnerable to somebody who you have a contractual relationship screwing up and losing their entire database. Your digital identity's recovery is based on things that nobody could ever guess, like your date of birth or your mother's maiden name, right? These things cannot be sufficient if we are reliant on that digital identity as our primary identity. So what does that mean in the future? How do you assert an identity on the internet in a way that doesn't make it trackable? That's a really complicated problem. Other technologies, so outside of kind of cyber technologies, what are things like synthetic biology going to do? What's graphene going to do? What are new types of semiconductors going to do over the next 5–10 years? Think about semiconductors that are completely flexible, can be imprinted into clothing, parasitic power from the RF that's around, and can compute from that. What does that mean? I have no clue, but I know we've got to start thinking about it now so we can put guardrails in place so we don't do something really stupid. What's become clear over the last few years is that values in technology are really important. So most technologies today implement a standard of some sort, and whether it's a standard from a formal standards body or it's an informal standards body or it's just a company way of doing things, most technology implements a standard. That standard encodes values. And I'm going to go back to new IP. So the thing that the Huawei and the Chinese government brought to ITU, its primary design goal seems to be surveillance and control. And so if that's where you start off with your new internet, everything else is going to have the center of gravity around surveillance and control. Is that what we want? I'd assert not. But it does mean that standards encode values, technology encodes standards, therefore technology encodes the values that are embedded in those standards. And so we need to have a much better view about how those standards are built. Here's an interesting factoid for you. In the key telecom standards bodies around the world, about 80% of the chair and vice chair positions in those telecom standards bodies are held by Chinese companies. Is that okay? I'm not picking on China, right? It's just, is it okay for one country to have that much power? The other thing is that Chinese companies, so people like Huawei and ZTE, own about 25% of all of the standard essential patents for telecoms, for 5G, for example. And so if you want to implement 5G, you have to license Chinese technology. That's okay today. Will it be okay in the future? We'll come back to that. The other thing we've got is supply chains. So things like solar winds have shown us that supply chains are weak. Things like CloudHopper, the attack against managed service providers who then went out to their customers. Things like the attack against the UK telecoms operators back in 2018, who went take over a telecoms operator, go after their customers, show us that supply chains are weak. I actually think it's worse than that. I think supply chains are currently unknowable. Right? They are so complicated. I think they are genuinely unknowable, which means they're impossible to risk manage. So how do you get confidence in this thing? Right? If I'm relying on it, how do I get confidence in the bit of technology in my hand? Because doing a manual analysis of all of the bits of software in here is a hiding to nothing. Right? This is a very, very simple device, right? The list of technology on the about page is 4.5 pages long. I'm not going to go through every single one of those and make a judgment. So we've got to find better ways of doing that. National Cyber Strategy got published and talks about the 5 pillars. I'm not going to go through them. You can read it. It's a great document, awesome piece of government writing, but ends up being about values. I said that with a straight face and everything. Didn't get a laugh. It's shocking. But some of the things in there sound really simple, but are actually incredibly difficult. So one of the things we effectively say in there is we're going to increase internet resilience. 3 words: increase internet resilience. Okay, so let's take this apart. Increase. If you're going to increase something, you have to be able to measure it, right? We know, I said right at the start, the science around cybersecurity sucks. So the measurements of risk, the measurements of confidence suck. So we haven't got a great base to start increasing things from. Internet. Don't even get me started. Are we talking about the autonomous systems that make up the communications platforms? Are we talking about the management protocols that run on top? Are we talking about the companies that run them? Or are we talking about the services that we all use every day? Don't know. We need to probably work that one out. And then resilience. Resilience against what? Is it resilience against somebody driving a JCB into a metro node, telecoms node down in the middle of London, which is relatively easy to fix? Or is it resilience against somebody consistently going after the supply chain in order to pre-position, in order to have capability against the UK in extremis? We have to define those terms in order to be able to actually understand how we're going to increase resilience. We haven't done that. We should probably do it quite soon. Measuring cybersecurity, measuring national security is really difficult. This isn't just about cybersecurity, right? I started there because it's what I know, but national security is changing. So if you think about the economy today and the society we live in, increasingly, it relies on access to technology. So if the technology doesn't work, the economy stops, society stops. That means that access to that technology, the integrity of it, its correct operation, becomes a national security issue. That then leads you to say, right, well, in that case, the easiest way to have confidence is to control it, right? So I want to control all the things I rely on, which leads to things like foreign direct investment controls. We're going to come back to that because I'm not sure that's a sensible way to do things. Controlling everything doesn't sound practical. But here's a question: what does sovereign mean anymore? So how is the UK a sovereign tech power? What does it mean? It doesn't mean that we can build absolutely everything from the sand through the silicon chips all the way through to the services that we rely on. It cannot mean that. What does it mean? And it's not just things like the Huawei 5G stuff and the fact that our policy had to change because of US action and so on and so on. It's things like Apple Private Relay. So Apple's put this privacy system in. You turn it on, law enforcement's job gets harder. How is that okay? How is it okay that a company halfway around the world can make a change to a technology that affects the ability of companies to stick to UK law? Right? We're not used to that. There has to be a proper debate about it. And there's lots of other technologies like it. Standards bodies were not ever set up to be tools of strategic power. They were set up to be lovely places where techies can go and talk and shout and abuse each other and hum. So the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, is awesome. Love it to bits. The way they vote, the way that the protocols that run your life are defined is by humming, right? So the protocols that run the internet, the way that they vote on them is you hum. The loudest hum wins. Now, it's worked for years, but I assert it's reasonably easy to fiddle that. Right? You send some shouty people and you kind of win. I joke, but all of the voting things in standards bodies are based on an assumption that everybody plays fair. These things are now, as I say, tools of state power, right? Or they're moving towards that. And so how do we protect the standards bodies so that they are not abused in that way? De facto standards, so things like Apple Private Relay, are just as big an issue for us. Whether they're set by a formal standards body or it's just 30% of all the mobile phones in the world act this way, those things are just as much of an issue. And so how do we responsible, values-driven governments start to have those conversations. Development of core technologies is worrisome. So I'm going to use microprocessors as an example. There are 5 main microprocessor designs in the world. 3 of them are commercial, 2 of them are kind of open. So the 2 I'll talk about are RISC-V and ARM. China has said, and it's Made in China 2025 strategy in public, we are going to have our own microprocessor by 2025. Okay, they're either going to build it from complete scratch or it's going to be RISC-V, because that's the only one that's completely open source and unencumbered by sanctions. Because ARM is UK and US run, RISC-V is the only one that's completely unencumbered and can be used as a sovereign thing. What does that mean? So if Chinese companies are driving the development of RISC-V as an architecture, what does that mean for us as users of it? Should we use it, not use it? Trust it, not trust it? And so on and so on. We've got to have a good way of trying to understand how we will use those technologies that have been designed by others. I'll give you another example. So there is a problem called buffer overflows in computer software. It's been around since 1972. We've strategically never done anything about it. And it's still one of the most exploited vulnerabilities today. A few years ago, the UK government decided we were going to invest to fix it. So we've put some money in through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund to pay ARM and some others to build a memory-safe microprocessor, get rid of buffer overflows for good. So originally work done by Cambridge University. We're paying for it to be done by ARM. There's some toolchain vendors. It's going to be awesome. We want everybody to use it because it makes everybody safer just by switching toolchain and processor. It's going to be great. What if it was the Russians that did it? Would you still be happy using it? Because there's one copy of ARM, right? There is one ARM ISA, and then it goes out to the other the companies that make silicon, that make chips, and you can make a value judgment, right? So I make a value judgment about a Huawei chip versus a Qualcomm chip, a ROC chip versus an Intel chip, right? If somebody else has put part of the design in the microprocessor, how do you make that judgment? Don't know, but we need to think it through because it's coming. The great thing about standards is they drive interoperability. The problem is we've balkanized technology already. We've done it, we just haven't quite noticed. If I take semiconductors, so again, US action against China in saying you can't have US source technology to build your chips means China is building different stuff. And so you're going to have semiconductors that are built in different ways, have different characteristics, and will probably have different security characteristics. Which ones do you use? How do you know which one you've got? Because in the end, it's a bit of black plastic with some sticky out legs in the middle of this thing, right? How do you know when you go buy it? How do you make that judgment? Telecoms. So I reckon we're going to end up with a base interoperability layer that everybody works to, and then specializations on top, one driven by China, one driven by the West. Right? And they're going to do different things. And so there's going to be competition in features. There's going to be competition in implementation. And again, things like new IP, how do you reset the values that are used for the global networks that we all rely on? For me, there's 2 outcomes here. There's a simple case, which is a Chinese-led one and a Western-led one. That's complicated because there's not going to be a complete stack. You're going to borrow things from each one. So actually understanding the properties of it will be difficult. The more complex one, where you have lots of little implementations based on top of those 2 or 3 or 4, I have no idea how you do that. It explodes combinatorially. I don't know how you understand all the different bits you're taking from around the world to bring together into a system that you then rely on. It's also not clear who's going to win. So the way that you win in technology is other people using it, right? Because you want the market access, you want the market share, because that drives prices down, it drives innovation up, all the other things. What's our value proposition to the rest of the world for the stuff we build versus the stuff other people build? And by we, I mean us and our allies, not just the UK. And what's the impact of all of this as you start talking it through? One of the things that we tolerate insecurity, and it's all of its different ways, because the risk of doing something is too great. I'll say again, the risk of doing something is too great. So think about the international financial system, right? SWIFT and its counterparts. So up until about, I don't know, what, 3 months ago, everybody was on SWIFT. SWIFT went down, everybody gets hurt the same way. Russia's not on SWIFT anymore. Value proposition's changed. The risk to them has changed. Therefore, the risk to us has changed. How do we start talking about that? How do you start to work through what balkanization does and does not do? As we start, the really risky thing for me is as you start to split, because that's where the uncertainty is. And that's going to be the next decade. So the not very good bit, which is the what do we do? So here's some things to think about. I think we've got to minimize the harm that's going to be caused by balkanization. I think stopping balkanization is way too late, right? It's done. We're on that path. We're not coming back from it anytime soon. How do we minimize the harm caused by that? And that could be, in some cases, you have still a single standard. In some cases, you have gateways. And in some cases, you just don't interoperate and you live with it. But there's something here about how the world, global economy, starts to coalesce around tech stacks over the next decade and what we can do to be part of that. We definitely need to get back into standards bodies, right? Not just us, but our allies, those that share our values. But we've got to be really careful we don't break stuff. Standards bodies are multi-stakeholder. Good standards bodies are multi-stakeholder. That means there's lots of different views. There's lots of different effort going into it. And no one community has too much power. We've got to keep that, right? Government should not run standards bodies. There you go. But neither should massively powerful companies. They shouldn't run them. Everybody's voice should be equal. They still need to be open. So we need to have standards bodies that anybody can come and play it, right? If you've got, it's like bring code, have a seat, right? That's where we need to get to. Everybody should be able to have a view in this stuff. But we do need to make sure that our values are encoded in there. And it doesn't mean that our values are uniquely encoded in there. It just means they're in there somewhere that we can use. I'm not saying that the Chinese have to use stuff that more suits our values. I'm saying that we have to have choice. What's government's relationship with the big tech companies? Right, and this is a killer for me because some of these companies have kind of moved to being transnational, supranational. Right, they're above governments, and some of them will choose which laws they want to obey by how they put services out. What does that mean in the future? Should we still be striving for unicorns? Right, is the unicorn company the one that is so massive and powerful? Is that still the right thing to do for global security? Question. I don't know, but I think it's a conversation we have to have. We have to invest in and protect our science. So underpinning all of this is a reality that says, bring cool stuff or shut up, right? If we just turn up and go, yeah, new IP, don't like that, it's bad, don't like that. Nobody's going to listen. Going and saying, don't like that, but here's something better. Here is a deterministic networking stack that works at terabit speeds. Oh, by the way, we've got terahertz communications over here. We've got low power stuff here, right? That's what we need to do. The only way we can do that is by investing in and protecting our science. And more importantly, having government usefully drag that science through into technology. The thing that we are, as a country, are really bad at is taking the amazing science that's done here and turning it into early stage capability. Government as customer of first resort is part of that, I think. And things like ARIA should help. ARIA is the innovation agency. We need to have advantage of some sort. So we need to be able to use that science, that technology, to have leverage in that ecosystem. Right, we have to be able to turn up and have influence, and that needs capability and knowledge. And for me, that means we need sticky ecosystems. So we need ecosystems of compatible and technology that feeds off each other so that it's difficult to copy. If we've got one thing, that's really easy to copy. If we've got 10 things that all work together, and the best place to get this capability is from the UK because we have these 10 things, that's much more difficult to copy. We've got to build international value propositions that drive the adoption of stuff that we like. It doesn't have to be ours, it just has to be stuff we like. So what's the value proposition for going this way versus that way? So this ecosystem versus that ecosystem. And this is the hard bit. We need new cybersecurity approaches, because the ones we've got at the moment end up putting trust in things that probably aren't trustworthy. Things like microprocessors, things like software, things like people. So we need to start building systems that are tolerant to vulnerability and exploitation in a scientific way, not in a wet finger in the air way. How do we rationalize and reason about some of these things so that we can do it in a repeatable way? We've got to fix some of the systemic issues so that we can build more complex things on top. And that's things like reliability and security, it's identity and all of those other things. We have to learn to measure things properly, because if we can't measure it, we can't fix it. And we know there's a bunch of stuff needs fixing. And then there's some new policy questions coming out of this for me. So we want free access to data. Yeah, we want to be able to give people access to data, to be able to use it to make the economy better. Does access to data in the style of the internet economy we have today, i.e. paying with your eyeballs, does that become a national security issue in the future? If it is used to train artificial intelligence, if it is used to drive models that can be used against us, is that a national security thing? Don't know, but we've got to do the work. And above all, we have to be sensible about how we use new technologies. Right? We have to really understand the impact, how they can be abused, whether maliciously or accidentally, and the impacts they can have. We've got to be realistic on what we can rely on technology to do for us. We've got to be honest about where technology has shortfalls and how we make up for that through policy, through people, through not using it in certain ways. We've really got to be honest and clear about the security and privacy properties of various things. Because if we can't do that, we can't explain it to people who actually use these things. And finally, we've got to be honest about the assurance and confidence we have in these systems. And coming around and saying, I'm going to have some auditors look at the source code for 3 days. It'll be awesome. Trust me. That's really not the way to do this in the future. We have got to have better ways of building technology, from standards through to implementations, through to national scale systems, through to things people use, and be able to talk about them in a way that the person in the street can understand and make their own sensible risk decisions. Thank you very much.